So I'm going to be reading from, as you said, the Acts 24. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation, and I'll be reading from Acts 24, 1 through 16. 5 days later, Ananias, the high priest, arrived with some of the Jewish elders and the lawyer Tertullus to present their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented the charges against Paul in the following address to the governor. You have provided a long period of peace for us Jews with foresight, have enacted reforms for us. For all of this, Your Excellency, we are very grateful to you. But I don't want to bore you, so please give me your attention for only a moment. We have found this man to be a troublemaker who is constantly stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the cult known as the Nazarenes. Furthermore, he was trying to desecrate the temple when we arrested him. You can find out the truth of our accusations by examining him yourself. Then the other Jews chimed in, declaring that everything Tertullus said was true. The governor then motioned for Paul to speak. Paul said, I know, sir, that you have been judge of Jewish affairs for many years, so I gladly present my defense for you. You can quickly discover that I arrived in Jerusalem no more than 12 days ago to worship at the temple. My accusers never found me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a riot in any synagogue or on the streets of the city. These men cannot prove the things they accuse me of doing. But I admit that I follow the way, which they call a cult. I worship the God of our ancestors, and I firmly believe the Jewish law and everything written in the prophets. I have the same hope in God that these men have, that he will raise both the righteous and the unrighteous. Because of this, I always try to maintain a clear conscience before God and all people.
I'll be reading from Acts 24 also, 17 to the end. After several years away, I returned to Jerusalem with money to aid my people and to offer sacrifices to God. My accusers saw me in the temple, and as I was completing a purification ceremony, there was no crowd around me and no rioting. But some Jews from the province of Asia were there, and they ought to be there to bring charges if they have anything against me. Ask these men here what crime the Jewish High Council found me guilty of, except for the one time I shouted out, I am on trial before you today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. At that point, Felix, who was quite familiar with the way, adjourned the hearing and said, wait until Lysias, the garrison commander, arrives. Then I will decide the case. He ordered an officer to keep Paul in custody, but to give him some freedom and allow his friends to visit him and take care of his needs. A few days later, Felix came back with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. Sending for Paul, they listened as he told him about faith in Christ Jesus. As he reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control and the coming day of judgment, Felix became frightened. Go away for now, he replied. When it is more convenient, I'll call for you again. He also hoped Paul would bribe him, so he sent for him quite often and talked with him. After two years went by in this way, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And because Felix wanted to gain favor with the Jewish people, he left Paul in prison.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Coach. You know, fear Fear is a short-term motivator. I don't know if you've thought much about it, but fear is kind of like money that way. People think that money will motivate them, but actually it only motivates you for a little while. You get a raise and you work really hard, and then about 6 months later your motivation is gone because you've already figured out how to spend the money for the next 5-10 years, right? Well, in the same way, fear is a short-term motivator. Imagine this. Not that any of you would ever do this, but you're driving 60 in a 45 and the police pull you over. As soon as those lights flash, right, you get that lump in your throat, your heart starts racing, little tremor in your hand as you reach for your license and your registration, and sure enough, Johnny Law writes you a ticket. It's a $75 fine plus 2 points on your license, and you know what that means. That means day after tomorrow, your insurance is going to go up as well, right? And in that moment, as soon as he hands you that citation, you know what happens? I become the best driver in the universe. Do you know what I mean? I obey every single statute, I'm like driving Miss Daisy, except I don't have Morgan Freeman narrating. You know what I'm saying? And it goes for 2 full days. For 2 full days, I am the perfect driver because I am not getting pulled over again. I'm not getting any more points on my license. And then, of course, well, the fear, it fades, right? I mean, the experience, the memory of it, the impact of it, it just kind of fades. And by day 3 or maybe day 4 or possibly, if you're really good, day 5, you become a Formula One driver again. All over the place, right? And you have totally forgotten about how you were going to be the best driver in the universe. Now, for those of you who don't have a driver's license, let me just put it this way. Do you remember the last time you sassed your mama or your grandmama? The last time you talked back to them and she just wore you out. You remember, right? I mean, before the sting had left your cheek, before you could sit down again, you were telling yourself you were going to behave. You would never disrespect your grandmother again. You would never disrespect your auntie again, whoever it was that you were talking back to. And time progresses, and it doesn't take long before there's like this rebellious streak in you, right? And all of a sudden you feel like your sense of justice has been infringed upon. And next thing you know, you become Johnny Cochran. You're a lawyer and you're going to tell her what's what. And sure enough, that house shoe comes out of nowhere and it hits you upside the head and you never even saw it, right? It's because fear, it's a short-term motivator. It just doesn't last for long. Now, I don't know if you know it or not, but that's why I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about hell and fire and damnation. It's not that I don't believe that there's such a place as hell, because I do. Unfortunately, I firmly believe that there's a place or a sphere. And it's not that I don't believe that there's such a thing as God's judgment, because I do. I personally believe that hell isn't a place that God creates. Hell is that place that's created when God gives you your wish and removes his presence for eternity. That's what hell is. And Jesus, whether I'm right or not, Jesus, who's the Son of God, he says there will be fire and there will be weeping and there will be suffering and there'll be gnashing of teeth, right? So, but you see, the reason I don't talk much about it is because it's not going to motivate you for very long. And it's not the kind of thing a relationship should be built on. A relation shouldn't be built on fear. Our relationship with God shouldn't be built on fear. But you know, this passage in Acts, this whole of Acts chapter 24 that Coach and Miss Barbara Stone read so well for us, you know, it demonstrates a momentary fear, and it does it with such perfect delivery that I just have to pause and admire it for a moment. Look back at verse 24 for me, okay? A few days later, Felix came back with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. Sending for Paul, they listened as he told them about faith in Christ Jesus. As he reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control and the coming day of judgment, Felix became frightened. "Go away for now," he replied. "When it's more convenient, I'll call for you again." He also hoped that Paul would bribe him, so he sent for him quite often and talked with him. And after 2 years went by in this way, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And because Felix wanted to gain favor with the Jewish people, he left Paul in prison. Now, the one verse that I just want you to see for a minute is actually verse 25. As he reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control and the coming day of judgment, Felix became frightened. "Go away for now," he replied. "When it's more convenient, I'll call for you again." In fact, you can even narrow it down. The part I'd like for you to see is just the one sentence. As he reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control in the coming day of judgment, Felix became frightened. Roy Sullivan is a name that I suspect that most of you have not heard of. Maybe if you are into trivia, you might be familiar with him. You see, Roy, he was born on a Wednesday in February the 7th of 1912 in Greene County, Virginia. And Sullivan spent his whole life being a United States Park Ranger in the Shenandoah National Park. As for over 4 decades, from the 1940s to the 1970s, Roy Sullivan, he was a park ranger. Now, you might say, well, what's so special about a man who was born in Greene County, Virginia, and then who worked for 4 decades in the Shenandoah National Park when it's too in Greene County, Virginia? He's just a basic guy who was born, found work, and grew up and lived his whole life in one place, like so many people have done, right? Well, you see, the thing that makes Roy special as a park ranger and as a human being is that from 1942 to 1977, Roy Sullivan was struck by lightning 7 times. Verifiable. An 8th that doesn't count because it's not been able to be verified. Now, the odds of being struck by lightning, in case you wonder, over the span of an 80-year life is 1 in 10,000. Now, believe it or not, according to the National Weather Service, the U.S. mortality rate, and this is the good news, I guess, the U.S. mortality rate for lightning strikes from 2009 to 2018 was around 10%, meaning that about 90% of the people who get struck by lightning survive. Now, don't get me wrong, they're not the same, but they survive. And so the odds of being struck 7 times by lightning over the course of your life is just phenomenal, you know? The first time it happened to Roy, it happened in 1942 when he was only 30 years old. He probably just considered himself lucky at the time to have survived, because the survival rate back then was much lower, of course. It was probably just an interesting story for him to tell. Yeah, I got struck by lightning and I survived, you know? So, you know, good story to tell with your buddies and that sort of stuff. But from the time he was 30 until the time he was 57, nothing happened to him. So he must have thought that was it. Game over, right? Nothing more to report. But then when he was 57 years old, just living his normal park ranger life, in July of 1969, he got struck by lightning again. Now, this time he lost his eyebrows and it set his hair on fire, but that's what happens when 100 million volts goes through your body. And that's about what a lightning strike is, give or take, 100 million volts. Now you can imagine, after having lost his eyebrows, after having had his hair set on fire, that this might have just kind of startled him a good bit. Can you imagine twice being struck by lightning, but then only just a year later, in July of 1970, he was struck again. This time it set his hair on fire, and this time it blew one of his boots off, and it blew a hole through his foot as the lightning exited his body. Now you can imagine what this must have done to his psyche, because somewhere he began to think that God was out to get him. He was struck by lightning again 2 years later in 1972. And then he was struck by lightning in August of 1973. And then he was struck by lightning by June of 1976. By the sixth time, he had determined that God was totally out to get him. And he carried a bucket of water with him to put his hair out wherever he went. He lived with that kind of fear. He was just totally mortified of lightning storms and thunderstorms, which the Shenandoah Valley has a lot of them. It has more than its fair share. And then, finally, in June the 25th, a Saturday, 1977, the way I figure it with leap year and all of that sort of thing, that was about 46 years ago today, he was struck one last time. Every strike coming in Greene County, Virginia, every strike coming in the Shenandoah National Park. Tragically, Roy Sullivan, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound on September the 28th, 1983. Now here's the point I don't get, okay? Here is the point I do not get. Long about the third or fourth time you're struck by lightning, if you really, truly believe that God is out to get you, answer me one question. Why not move? No, for real? We're like, why not change? Why not change profession? Why not go somewhere else? Why would you just keep staying in the same place? Why would you keep doing the same thing until it all but destroyed you? You see, by the end of his life, people wouldn't even come close to him. They were afraid to be around him outside. They were literally afraid to be around him. We're told that he had a significant kind of PTSD that comes to those who've experienced lightning strikes. It's about 300 or 400 folks a year who experience that. We understand that he had deep depression, that the voltage going through his body so often had addled his mind some, that his life was just impossible. And it seems to me that if you're really that afraid, you change the equation. You change the environment. You don't make the assumption that you were created to be a victim. Now, Felix wasn't a victim at all. You see, Felix was a Roman governor. That's who Felix was. He was part of the great Roman Empire. He was a representative of the emperor. He had correspondence with the emperor himself. Most people couldn't get, within earshot of the emperor. But Felix, he had the emperor's ear. He was one of his guys. And Felix was the most influential, connected, powerful man in the region that we know as Caesarea, which includes Judea, where Jerusalem is, back 2,000 years ago. And so you got to know that makes this statement in verse 25 all the more impressive to me. Verse 25, as Paul reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control and the coming day of Jesus, Felix became frightened. Now, Governor Felix, he's not afraid of anything that walks, talks, or digs holes. I mean, he doesn't have any reason to be, right? Here comes Paul in. Felix is up on his little throne, and next to him is his bride Drusilla. We're told that he's familiar with the way. We're also told that his wife Drusilla is Jewish, and so he has some understanding of what's been transpiring, right? And so he's sitting up high, and Paul comes in after having been in chains for a while, still probably healing up from the beating he took in chapter 23, and he's got a couple of guards next to him. And then, of course, Felix, because he's the governor, he's got his own bodyguard, so there are other guards around next to him, right? He has absolutely no reason to be scared. At least that's what it would seem like, because if there is a man in control of the situation, in control of his situation, it's Felix sitting right there on his throne. And then Paul, he begins to converse with Governor Felix and his bride about Jesus. And that verse 25, the one that caught me, it says that Paul talks with him about righteousness and about self-control and judgment. And that totally makes sense to me. That's exactly how I would do it. That is exactly how I would approach it. You start by talking about how perfect God is, right? And then you just point out that we're not. And I don't know too many people who will argue with you and say, no, actually, I am perfect. If you are, Shepherd Pratt's got a room for you. And then after you talk about how God is perfect and how you're not perfect, then all you do is you just move into what righteousness is. You just say, well, it just breaks down like this. When we talk about righteousness, when we talk about God's righteousness, all we're talking about is right living, right behaving, right speaking, right thinking, right valuing, right ordering of your time, your resources, your power. It's the recognition that God gave you your life, and without Him you have nothing. That's kind of what righteousness really is. And then you can just totally see how you'd move from righteousness to self-control, because you know that's the deal for all of us, right? the deal for all of us is that we could be righteous if it wasn't for our lack of self-control. I mean, don't get me wrong, we can call it all kinds of stuff, right? We can call it the 7 deadly sins and, pride and avarice and malice and hatred and, et cetera, et cetera. But it really just comes down to self-control. If I could only just keep my mouth shut, if I could only just respond with the right attitude, if I could only just work when I'm supposed to work and take it easy when I'm supposed to take it easy, if I could only just listen and care about others instead of caring about myself. It's all about self-control. Anything that we've ever done to hurt somebody else is about our self-control, our lack of it. Because if we had self-control, right, we wouldn't be doing those things. That's why I say that it totally makes sense that he would first tell him about Jesus in verse 24 and then talk about righteousness and then go to self-control and then land the plane with saying, and you know what that inherits all of us? Well, God's judgment. The wrath of an offended God. The wrath of a God that we have flipped off. The wrath of a God that we have despised, that we have shown contempt for. The wrath of a God who created us to be his own. And we told him, we'll take it from here, thank you very little. And how dare you tell me how to spend this life that you gave me? So it probably isn't too hard to explain what judgment looks like. And it's not going to be like the little petty judgments that you and I have experienced in our lifetime, other people judging us. Oh, no. This is going to be the one where there's no explanation. This is going to be one where you can't come up with a good enough excuse to get you out of it. Because unlike with other folks whose knowledge is limited and you can say, I didn't do it, it wasn't me. Actually, with God, his knowledge is not limited and you can talk all you want. And I can just imagine him saying, let's go to the instant replay and pop it up, right? And that thought of God's judgment must have been so intense. Just in that moment, when Felix is being real, when he's not being all in control, just in that moment when he's not thinking he's all that in a bag of chips, right? Just in that moment, he recognizes that judgment is going to be real. And you know what he does? He says, let's take a break, and I'll talk with you a more convenient time. And he sends him away, hoping that Paul will bribe him and he'll let him go. And you totally get why Felix sends him away. It's classic human, right? As he reasoned with them about righteousness, self-control, and the coming day of judgment, Felix became frightened. Go away for now, he replied. When it's more convenient, I'll call for you again. Go away for now. When it's more convenient, I'll call for you again. Boy, those words sound familiar to you? When it's more convenient, I'll call for you again. And so he sends him away until he's not scared anymore. Until the fear has gone away. He keeps doing the same things that he's done. hoping that it'll just work out. Maybe I won't get struck by lightning. Maybe I can keep everything the same and judgment won't come for me. You know, it's hard to imagine being Roy Sullivan. I've been thinking about him so much for a week now. I really have. And I know this is just my perspective because my heart goes out to this man. I mean, he didn't ask for any of this, right? He didn't ask for this. But, and this is just my perspective, I know. But if I was Roy and I thought God was out to get me, then I would have tried to figure out what it takes to make peace with the one who's out to get me. Do you know what I'm saying? I'd have tried to sort this out somehow, some way. And I can't help but believe that Paul wanted to tell Felix that same thing. I don't know if he got interrupted or not. I don't know if he got to get it all out before Felix sent him away or not. But I can pretty much tell you what Paul said because actually it's written in 5 or 6 places. One of my favorites is where he wrote in Romans chapter 5, just verses 1 and 2, and then 9 through 11. Therefore, since we have been made right in God's sight by faith, we have peace with God because of what Jesus Christ, our Lord, has done for us. We have peace with God. Verse 2, because of our faith, Christ has brought us into this place of undeserved privilege where we now stand and we confidently and joyfully look forward to sharing God's glory. Sharing God's life with God. And then verse 9, and since we've been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, He will certainly save us from God's condemnation. We do not have to be afraid of God's judgment. Jesus will save us from God's condemnation, for since our friendship with God was restored by the death of His Son while we were still His enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of His Son. So now we can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends with God. Put your faith in Jesus, give your whole self to Him, and you don't ever have to worry about what happens when the lightning strikes. Or you can be like Felix. You can just walk away from this conversation and let whatever that fear inside you is pass, because it will pass. It always does. And you can keep the scenario just like it is and hope that lightning doesn't strike. I want to ask Taemin and Kyung Mi, who I'm so happy that they're back. I want to invite them up. And Taemin is he's going to sing a song that has been heavy on Patrice's heart, and I think is an important ending to our conversation tonight.